And with that, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to March's Inclusion Talk Series as we commemorate Women's History Month. My name is Rhett Burden. I'm the Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at Compass Family Services, and I'm so excited to welcome you all here today for our Inclusion Talk Series. Please do me a favor, if you haven't already done so, put yourself on mute as I get ready to introduce our speaker and turn it over to her today. Ifeoma Ike is a renowned human rights and civil rights lawyer, author, strategist whose career centers on two things: designing pathways to equity and helping leaders problem solve through an equity lens. She is the founder of Chief Equity Weaver of the award-winning consultancy Pink Cornrows, which in part supports how corporate, political, and nonprofit organizations better achieve internal and external equity, diversity, and social impact goals. Ife is the author of the best-selling book, The Equity Mindset, which she describes as being the pocket thought partner for the person tired of just talking about change. Growing up as a disabled, poor, first-generation girl in Trenton, New Jersey, and subsequently pursuing her undergrad and graduate studies as a Storier Scholar at West Virginia University, Ife has been described as having a working philosophy that equity must be urgent and to solve something and not let it be left to one person to fix. She was tapped to co-lead the Public Advocates Office Transition Committee, the second highest executive office in New York City. A few years later, that office recommended her to be its very first appointee to the City of New York's Conflict of Interest Board. She has served on the board of the Women's Prison Association, Nigerian Healthcare Foundation, the National Black Law Students Association, among many others. She has provided pro bono support on the ground in Haiti, in her backyard in Brooklyn, New York, and as part of high-profile movements, including being a member of the Ferguson Legal Defense Committee. She has been a guest lecturer at several institutions, including Cornell, Harvard, and Yale, and has been featured by several media outlets, including MSNBC, Vanity Fair, the Huffington Post, CNN, and HBO, just to name a few. And with all of that, I bring to you Ifeoma Ike, our speaker for March's Inclusion Talk Series.
Thank you, Rhett. That is the best introduction I have received, definitely in 2024, maybe ever. And I'm nervous now because I had a really regular schmegular day, and now I have to give a really good talk. If you all have not done so already, please, please, please put in the chat where you're from, maybe a little bit about yourself. It's always helpful for me to get a sense of who's in the room. I do have a conversation prepared for today, but I really am also looking forward to the conversation part. And so if you hear me moving really quickly, that's why. But if there are points that you want me to go back to, or if you want to really drill down on an area, this really is a conversation of people who are already doing the work. In preparation for this, that was something that was really important to both Rhett and I. And if you haven't, please put an emoji, clap emojis for Rhett, or whatever way to just signify his leadership. Sometimes you don't really think about what it means to facilitate and bring people together. But we will talk a little bit today about my journey into this work. But my journey as a form of modeling what I call the equity journey, which is one of the many parts of what I feel is an important part of how we develop and also act on an equity mindset. So I'm going to share my screen. I think, yes, I just was asked if I wanted to do something, and that would stop other things. So can everyone see the screen? Everything's cool. So I'm going to start a little bit. Rhett challenged me to kind of go a little into myself. So the two people on the right and the left are the same people. On the right, or on my left, I think it's everyone's left. It is my mother, Bernice Chigiago Ike. I apparently had stopped her right before she was going to work. She is in her nurse's outfit, but I wanted to get my nails painted. So she is holding a bottle of nail polish. And I'm looking at the camera like, what's wrong with getting glammed up before mommy goes to work? And the other picture is my mom and I. A year ago, we were in Ghana. And I start this by saying that my equity journey really is something that, in all honesty, I think a couple years ago, I would have attributed a lot of my a lot. Oh, I'm sorry. My computer is acting up. Give me a second. A lot of my training to being a background as a researcher, background as an attorney. But over the years, I've really realized that many of us come from communities that have been solving problems that haven't been addressed for a very long time. My parents came from Nigeria in the 80s at a time where there was, which hasn't really changed, discrimination towards immigrant communities, biases as to what they will or will not bring when they come into this nation, tropes about what it means to be from another country, what it means to be an other. And my mother eloquently shares, I asked her to do the forward in my book. She talks a little bit about what it means to at times be judged for her accent, be judged for the fact that she did not graduate from their version of high school. She had to be pulled out at their version of eighth grade, and what it meant to come and start working as a domestic and eventually as a kitchen aide, and then working to become a nurse. I say all that to say that my equity journey has a lot to do with how I'm able to see problems. And I challenge that when we think about the problems in the communities that we are serving, or the problems within the communities that we are serving, and really thinking about why is the work that we are doing not sticking? Why is it that we have data that continues to show that the same communities are experiencing the same types of issues, and yet many of us are committed to making sure that our mission-focused work does result in sustained change? And I argue that some of that has to do with how we better connect the ways that we engage with equity and inequity in our own lives, the ways that we respect the histories and the journeys of individuals that have come through before us, the ways that we don't shy away from the ways that power impacts who we are, and sometimes when we also hold power, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but also what it means to have the privilege of changing culture. Oftentimes, when we talk about privilege, we talk about it in the limited sense of who has it and who doesn't. But I challenge all of us to think about the fact that by the sheer fact that we're on this call today having a dialogue about equity and about activating an equity mindset, that also means that we have the privilege to activate differently, to, as Rhett had shared with you, I'll stop talking about it and really be okay with the fact that we will continue to make mistakes as we move forward. But that part of the journey is really believing that the collective of us trying to improve will get us to a different destination where we can always find another point to improve and to work on, and also to be challenged personally. So we'll talk a little bit more about this equity journey, because it is really about a personal journey and a personal, sometimes confrontation with our past. Before I move on to the next slide, I will share one story about when people are like, how did you get into this work? That beautiful bio that Rhett shared was in no way, shape, or form linear. And in many ways, at times, it was very painful. But one of the unexpected run-ins with the concept of equity happened when I was in grad school. I went to school in West Virginia. For people that do not know, it is the second whitest state in the United States, and it's also a very poor state. And I grew up poor. I'm the oldest of five. And my roommate was also the oldest of five. She was the daughter of coal miners. And we shared each other's stories with each other. And we came to the conclusion that we didn't actually want each other's poverty. We kind of like laughed at each other and we're like, I don't want to go through what you went through. And she was like, I don't want to go through what you went through. And it was a point of connection, especially for me as a city girl, seeing poverty in a different way, seeing inequity play out in communities that where I was from, I had not seen that type of inequity. And for her, that was really her first time being in that close proximity for an extended period of time with a young Black woman. And so that was, you know, eye-opening as a part of my life journey in really understanding somebody outside of my community, and also a way of understanding poverty that is not often discussed as widely in even the public realm. We do all have a bias and we are primed to think of certain communities when we hear poverty. But as I like to tell people, the way that power has been designed, it doesn't really serve any of us, regardless of race, ethnicity, background, ability. That's really important for us to think about. The next real experience as an adult, in my book, I share some experiences as a child, which are actually kind of funny and also kind of sad, but I try to channel my inner child lens as to how I was seeing the world, was when I was in grad school. It was a very white male dominated field in behavioral research communications. My sorority sister graduated a year before me. She was the first Black woman to graduate from this program. I was the second Black woman to graduate from this program, which is also to show that that is not a point of celebrating. That is to say that there really was a lack of diversity in this program. In my year, however, I was not the only Black woman in my program. And a beautiful sister from the South, who was a little shorter than me, a little thicker than me, had an accent, had a little bit of a lisp, came from an HBCU. I saw her as another sister that I could vibe with, but I also recognized that we were treated extremely differently in this program. And for the life of me, I did not understand why, in many ways, even though I didn't feel like I was experiencing equity in this program, I also recognized that I was being treated almost tokenized as the type of researcher that others wanted to work with, while she was always highlighted for her differences, always highlighted for her accent. People would try to play her and say, "What? Can you say that again? We don't really understand what you're saying." And that started to impact her morale. So as we start talking about how we design cultures for all people to be able to exist, I want us to really think about our experiences where we have been the ones targeted and made to be different than our peers, when we are the ones that have been made to be the exceptional one. And if we're honest, when we are the ones that are doing that work, when we are the ones that are signaling people out in spaces, maybe even unintentionally. But this is kind of the hard work of, if we're going to be co-laborers in how we make equity stick, then what does it mean in our own personal journey as we're doing this work? So very specifically, when I've been doing this training on the equity mindset for some years now, there are so many different characteristics I feel of what an equity mindset is. But if I were to say that there were four concrete ways of looking at it, it would really be about understanding your own personal journey, as I mentioned, understanding how systems were designed, understanding why inequities not only exist, but why they persist. And then also understanding that identity, history, and the impact of history still plays a role in what is harming people that we love and people that we serve today. Those things take work. Those things are more than a one-time workshop. Those things are going to be things that we get upset about and angry about. And for some people, those are also things that we get tired of hearing. I like to challenge folks that get tired of hearing that the only thing more tired, or the only thing that's more tiresome than hearing a thing is living a thing, right? So it's understandable that this can sometimes feel like, why are we revisiting this? But I assure you that part of the joy of doing this work is living out the theory that the more I understand about the communities that I'm supporting, the more I am better able to support them. There's a quote that I put in the book from Albert Einstein where he says, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solutions. And that felt powerful to me as a solutionist. I want to be clear, I am very impatient. I went to law school and I don't do court cases. I'm too impatient for that. I feel like, how am I going to help just this one person when I can help a whole community? So I am a very impatient person. I like to get to solutions. I like to solve things. But I also recognize that how you build a solution and how things get solved is just as important as the thing you solve in a moment, right? Because the hope is that we are making solutions last beyond that moment. So we really have to be thoughtful about, do I understand the problem? Now, many of you all have probably seen versions of this graphic at some point in time, which is just to talk about the root causes of problems. There was another slide that I wanted to share, which was, but that I was afraid that was going to lead into a whole nother conversation about my infatuation with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But the reason why I love his pyramid is that it not only has a pyramid with the fattest part at the bottom, really signifying the parts of what it means to be human that just are must-haves. But according to the theory, it is very hard for a people and for a community to really have what is at the top, which is self-determination en masse, without the foundational parts being satisfied, which includes food, shelter, healthcare, intimacy, environmental purity. Those things are so important in how we are able to maneuver. And yet, when we think of the fact that many of our communities have unclean water and air, many of our communities have, depending on where you live in food apartheid or food deserts. Depending on your zip code, you may have a home or you may not have a home, right? Many of those things are symptoms of a deeper problem. And so an equity mindset is a challenge. How many times can we try to get as close to the root cause of what is creating these ongoing chronic issues, right? The symptoms, a lot of our work in service spaces focus on the symptoms and at times the problem. That's why we are hired. We are hired to be I see you all as kind of the first responders to how people are able to live. And I know that that means that the issues that people are dealing with when you all leave hit you and stick with you beyond just the support that you're providing, right? So some of this is, how do we hack the spaces that we're in to get even deeper into addressing the issue that we are concerned about, or the issue that's causing the problem, even if the way that we hack it is not within our job description, even if it's not necessarily the space that we tend to work in. So let me just give a couple examples of some things that I've had to help for some other spaces. A couple of weeks ago, I was asked to speak about the mental health care system. How is it that we have what we have? What is it that practitioners should know in their training, in their curriculum as they're doing their work? And I believe in mapping. I believe in, how do we map out the foundation of how we got here? So as I discussed an equity journey, I think there's also a way to discuss the journey of the different professions that we are in. And they all have an origin story. Almost all of our work, we all know, starts from the genocide of Indigenous and Native American communities, the forced enslavement of African communities. But it's also important to recognize that systems are built and kept together by laws and policies, and then practices and beliefs, right? And so I created just this very simple map for mental health care practitioners to recognize that the creation, for example, of an inferior race was at one point called science. That the way that we determine that who is white, who is Black, who was other, was all considered science, even though we know that race is not actually a real thing, but it is a real thing as it relates to an indicator that determines your quality of life. I also highlighted for them that there is a byproduct to when we talk about enslavement. What does that really mean? Can we break down what that means, right? That includes forced breeding. That includes experimentation on people's bodies. That includes that when people run away, they're not only wanted, but by law, they're declared unwell. So that means liberation is seen as something that is disruptive and needs to be responded to by force. But there's also two other things that are polarizing. There was the ongoing legalization of punishing individuals that tried to protect themselves from this type of harm. And then there's this concept called racial apathy. And it happens with a lot of communities. Racial apathy is when we ignore and we don't have a feeling to the fact that communities have been harmed. As an individual who is disabled, it pains me that we don't talk about those who came before us, not just as individuals who were enslaved and were forced to build a country, but by definition, 100% of the individuals who were enslaved also were dealing with mental trauma. They were dealing with a disability. It is largely seen as one of the largest mass disability issues of our country. And not only is that a tragedy, but it also means that there's a strength that we are not even seeing within disabled communities as to what it means when we are flipping the script on the narrative of what it means to be disabled, what it means to be abled, what it means to be valued in our society. So equity mapping helps us really understand the origin story of how we got here. I like to say, like, sometimes we get mad at each other way too often when we really should be getting mad at the systems that we inherited. So when we really think about what did we inherit, that's part of that Albert Einstein understanding the problem, how we got here. This is a map that I'm happy to share with Rhett afterwards for people to go through with their teams. It allows us to really think about the different parts of an equity mindset that organizations and teams should be tackling all the time at different times. But this is also something that speaks to resources. Many people who do this work, it's hard for them to explain to their organizations that this is not just a one-time workshop. This is not just about feeling good. This is not just about celebrating different ethnicities and groups and causes, all of which are important. But to really develop an equity mindset within our teams, we really have to look at our processes. We have to know how we operate. We need to also look at how power shows up in our workspaces and in our cultural spaces. And then we have to be clear as to how systemic racism and other isms show up in our work. I like to always say that when we talk about racism and ableism and sexism, that is not to the exclusion of any other ism. That is to acknowledge that ism is about systems, ism is about laws. These are things that were put into place to keep a barrier between communities, right? So when we are explicit about these barriers, then we are also explicit and can be more specific with our solutions. So that's important to keep in mind. So like I said, I really want us to get into some type of conversation because one of the things that I enjoy is hearing from different people that may be dealing with different things and really trying to get a sense as to how we can kind of design strategies together. One of the questions I like to ask folks is to really think about how do we design rooms for anyone from anywhere to come to our culture right now and thrive. So I want to give just 10 seconds for people to think about this question in a different way. Can anyone from anywhere come to your current organizational culture right now as it is and thrive? And that doesn't have to be yes or no. That can be a little gray, but I want you to kind of think of the things that make your culture a welcoming culture. And then maybe some of the things that are like, this would actually be hard for some communities to thrive. So I'm going to go through some practices that have been helpful. for us to think about. I'm going to go through them quickly, and then we can reference them as we move along. But I want to talk first a little bit about the power of the invitation is really transformative. Oftentimes, when we talk about communities, communities are seen as the beneficiaries of our work. But I challenge folks to find ways to encourage our systems to see those who are in our community as co-laborers of our work, and even beyond that, leaders of our work. Right? There's a beautiful book called Braiding Sweetgrass. I encourage people to pick the book up. It's written by Robin Wall Kimmerer, whose background is from an indigenous community. And she talks about the beauty of basket weaving. That in itself, it is transformative because it has this concept of kind of tearing down as you are pulling weeds and pulling wheat, if you will, pulling the different strands. So you are destroying the natural habitat temporarily, but then you are weaving with other once not even intertwined strands to create something new. And when we talk about inclusion, it's more than representation, but we're really talking about is what is the power, what is the fission, what is the synergy that happens when communities that oftentimes aren't interacting with each other, what do we yield by creating that space? That also means that sometimes we have to relinquish some control. So when we tend to bring community or talk about community voices, we usually design a space for them to give their input. Maybe we'll give a survey. All of that is great. But if we can push it a little bit where we are seeing community members, regardless of their title, regardless of what they've acquired, regardless of their income, to be co-leaders in the issues that are impacting their lives on a daily basis, then in many ways we are hacking the systems that create power divides, especially socioeconomic divides amongst communities based on color or citizenship. We are in action saying that in our processes, we're going to create equity by ensuring that those who live this thing that we're talking about on our websites are also a part of the strategy as we move forward. Doing this with organizations that are over 100 years old is very difficult. I've done this work with a pretty large healthcare, without putting their name out there, healthcare organization. And there was resistance at first to invite people to some of their prestigious spaces like their research board. And how do we invite individuals that don't have a background in research to be a part of our research board? And my response to that is that narrative is research, right? Experience is research. The collection of experiences is research. That's called qualitative research. So there are ways that we can also use our positions to qualify our community members as experts in what they do. And that's very important for us to do, for those of us that are inside the system, to ensure that we create different narratives of the communities that we are trying to include. Which also leads me to number 2, which is unlearning marginalization tropes. Now, there is no shortage of tropes when it comes to what we mean when we say, or what we feel and hear when we hear the word underrepresented, when we hear the word marginalized, when we hear the word disadvantaged. On one side, there's a lot of data that supports why we would use those terms. But if we're honest, there's also something on the other side that has been embedded in our minds around the worthiness of these communities, the deservedness of some communities versus other communities, and also the power of communities that are marginalized. So there's this quote in this book called Care Work that I'm actually going to read out because I believe that it's important in the work that we all do. And it's a challenge for many spaces when it comes to how we are including, especially those that have disabilities in our work and in leadership. So the quote says, "When I think about access, I think about love. I think that Crips solidarity and solidarity between Crips and not non-yet Crips is a powerful act of love, and I got your back. It's in the big things, but it's also in the little things we do moment by moment to ensure that we all in all our individual bodies get to present fiercely as we make change. Embedded in this is a giant paradigm shift. Our crip bodies aren't seen as liabilities, something that limits us as being as something that limits us and brings pity, or something to nobly transcend. Because I'm just like you. Our crip bodies are gifts, brilliance, fierce, skilled, valuable assets that teach us things that are relevant and vital to ourselves, our communities, our movements, the whole gosh darn planet. I think this quote is so powerful because what I believe that Leah is challenging us to think about is how much equity do we leave on the table when we not include, when we uninclude, when we disinclude, when we uninvite communities that know inherently in their bodies what the problems are and probably have been dreaming about the solutions for a very long time. If we are continuing to see the same communities on the other side of marginalization, do we challenge our systems enough to really think about how are we including their genius into the space? And do we see their experiences as genius? Do we see their opinions as concerns, or do we just see them as complaints? So a lot of this is about how we challenge ourselves with the communities that we say that we are serving, and recognizing that they too have a repository of solutions for us to not only get to more equity, but to sustain it. This one is challenging, and this is about reimagining conflict by abandoning competition. So one of the byproducts of a white dominant culture, and I always say white dominant culture is about culture, it's not about people, but white dominant culture and the systems that were created that we all inherited centers competition. And as a result, everyone is kind of on an independent track. Everyone on LinkedIn is showing you the great thing that they got today. And in many ways, even subconsciously, some of it is about competition. And I'm not saying all competition is wrong or bad, but I do think that what gets suppressed is the power of interdependency, that we actually coexist and we actually are well when we recognize that we share this world together, that we actually build communities together, that when we have things like food deserts and food apartheid, that is because there are policies that had determined that those people are going to just have to work a little harder to get fresh food than the rest of us. That is not by accident. And oftentimes what happens is competition impacts communities that were already marginalized in a more deeper, disparate way, because now they have to be hyper independent, hyper competitive, and at times hyper conflictual even within their own communities to break out. I often tell folks that one of the things that I didn't realize I was developing subconsciously is that for anybody who grew up in the hood, a lot of what you were taught as a young kid is, I got to get out the hood. We don't necessarily talk about how we return to the hood. And we actually don't, as children, get asked enough, how did the hood become the hood? We are constantly trying to leave, right? So I want us to, I'm talking, there's a lot of data that supports this, but I like talking about this in regular language because oftentimes it's the subtle ways that we learn how to compete with each other. It's the subtle ways that we see other groups as being the reason why we're in the situation we're in, or explaining away the systems that have prevented groups from thriving. And at this moment, I challenge us to center Adrienne Maree Brown's, and I have her quote here. She has an amazing book called Emergent Strategy. I challenge us to really think about what it means when we say that you can lean on me. What then does that mean that you are expecting from me and I from you? And not in like a kumbaya way, although kumbaya is beautiful, but what does that mean that we have to challenge as far as how we work with each other? What does it mean that we have to challenge with individuals who wear the title of managers and leaders? What does it mean as we operate on a day-to-day basis that the way we're going to judge our KPIs for moving on is how strong our interdependency of our systems are with each other, and not necessarily how much we compete with each other to resolve and get to solutions. The last couple I'll go through really quickly is really looking at power as an external and internal thing, right? Sometimes power is about pushing against the system, and other times power is about utilizing the space that we have right now to maximize the type and the strength of the equity that we are able to perform, right? And that includes, how do I find ways to get the external genius from the community to be respected internally in a system that maybe doesn't necessarily rock with community like that? What does it look like for me to model the fullness of what it means to be, yes, I'm educated, and that may mean something to people, but I like to tell people all good things come from the hood, right? From hoop earrings to Cardi B. So you're gonna have to respect all aspects of who I am when I come into the space. And it is somewhat brave, especially for those of us who have intersectionalities that include ethnicity, race, ability, and gender, and orientation. What it means to show up as our authentic self is not always safe. So modeling that internally means that we also have to have people that have even more privilege and power than us at times to protect us or to stand with us in solidarity, not just allyship, but in solidarity to ensure that we are also safe internally. So again, this is a slide that I think I'm going to share with Rhett to share with others, because really this is here to challenge, A, do we do these things, and how do we do these things? And it's not a silo activity. It really is about how we look at power as something we inherited, but how we also see power as something that we can take advantage of. And then the last two slides, I just kind of touched on impact, on the impact of allyship. I saw this quote in an essay. It's an excerpt, and it was a woman who I believe is absolutely, I would probably call her an ally, but she challenged herself as to whether or not the community that she served would call her an ally. And it was just a reminder that there are times when we want to be rewarded naturally for the ways that we show up for communities, for the ways that we serve. But at times we don't necessarily ask those communities about how we serve and if our service is meeting their needs. And also if there are other needs that they need to be met. So I love how she challenges the reader. For example, she says, you know, if I consider myself an ally to African American people, but don't pay reparations in some form, would I be called an ally? If I consider myself an ally to people with disabilities, but host an event that's not accessible, would they call me an ally? And she herself is a queer woman who also asks whether or not people who claim that they're allies for queer people, but continue to vote against the interests of queer people, would she see them as an ally? So this is just an exercise of how much do I know about the needs of the communities, the rights, the not just civil, but the human rights of the communities that I am serving. And if I call myself an ally, is that something that's been rewarded to me by a community member, by a community leader, or is that a way of me kind of rewarding myself? And that may feel harsh, but kind of like the word humility, she challenges us that ally is bestowed from the community to someone, that it is about how we show up consistently in that space. And yes, there are times when we show up that they're not necessarily going to be feeling what we do. That happens. But that doesn't mean that we don't keep showing up. So it's something to think about. I like to say, the nice way I like to say it is, the reward for equity is more equity. There's always something else to fix. There's always something else to improve. But the ways, if it matters to us that we are seen as partners in liberation for other people, the most important thing is to show up. And it's also to keep our ear as a bridge to what our communities saying that they need as we're doing the work. And then finally, the last thing is just about, there's a chapter in my book that's just about, are your people safe? And I challenge folks to really go through that chapter. But SAFE is just a simple acronym for me, which is seen holistically, that all your people have access to support, that they are free not only to address conflict, but to be in conflict which oftentimes is difficult, especially when we think about the concepts of sexism and misogynoir, right? Are all femme folk able to be in a space where they can raise a conflict and they are not going to be seen as the quote unquote angry Black woman or the person who is rocking the boat or causing trouble. And also our community members encouraged and radically affirmed. And that encouraged and radically affirmation, again, is for me the difference between allyship and solidarity. That even when it's tough, what are the ways that we acknowledge, even beyond the February and the March and the September, the traditional months where we commemorate certain communities and groups? How are we always making sure that we show up? How are we always making sure that we are discussing liberation, recognizing that when your colleague leaves their cubicle every day or leaves that site every day, they are still encountering the realities of the world as they're just trying to get home. Internally, I do question, how do we prioritize resources to do this work? When we find out that there is an office of equity or a diversity specialist, is it a one-person show? Does that person need a team? Can we advocate for resources? Can we make sure that we are explaining to folks that this is not just a workshop, but this is about people's lives? This is about improving the quality of health for individuals. And we, as the people who are partnering in that work, need all the tools and resources to do that work. So that requires seeing equity as a professional development priority. That requires us as creating more webs of support and experts. That requires us to be humble about what we know and what we don't know, and to see acquiring knowledge as an ongoing part of our work. So this is just a reflection map that you all can use as an activity. It has different questions here to really get a sense of how we are thinking about our people, how we are thinking about not just learning, but unlearning, and a whole range of self-reflective questions for teams and individuals that I will also make sure that I get to everyone. So I will stop there because that was a lot, but I would love to hear any thoughts, questions, feedback from anyone in the space. But thank you all for allowing me to close out your Women and Femmes History and Future Month.
Ife, thank you so much for sharing that with us today. For those that work at Compass Family Services and those members of our community that are here, we're very, very appreciative of that. Anyone that's here at Compass, I have additional copies of Ife's book, The Equity Mindset. So if you want a copy, all you have to do is come and see me. It's been provided to some of our managerial staff, but I want to give it to anyone that's interested. And before we turn it over to question and answer, I wanted to ask you one of the things that you mentioned, and I would love your perspective to share on the group, especially for this amazing group of folks that are working with really the most vulnerable of populations that have these intersecting identities. And you mentioned sort of the way people show up in the way they feel in their body, whether we're thinking historically about what happened to the slave, and that's drapetomania, when it was considered a psychological disorder that someone enslaved would run away. Or you think about the present day knowledge of somatic theory and the ways in which that sort of trauma can show up in people's bodies. What advice would you give? Because again, we are working with really vulnerable populations where we're not always able to do as much as we wish we could. What insight would you give regarding that, the way in which it shows up and what people can do to combat that, to take care of themselves?
Wow, I love that question. I don't think I've ever been asked that question, but it reminds me of, I was honored to design what to date is still the only municipal strategy to focus specifically on Black mental health here in the city of New York. And why that's important is because oftentimes mental health strategies and a lot of equity strategies focus on, they use kind of like, for lack of a better phrase, all lives matter language. And it there's quite a bit of data that shows that when equity work is being used in spaces, the community that people tend to be the most afraid to really touch on is Black communities. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But for whatever reason, people are afraid to even say the word Black. They're afraid to talk about the history of Black folks. And if we talk about interdependency, there is this tendency to see it as separate from um, everybody else's life. What then happens, as you so accurately mentioned, is that there are generational things that occur with all communities, but especially as it relates to African American communities, what we hold in our bodies, what we normalize, that also show up in how we are able to keep it together. Um, I think it was James Baldwin that talked about, like, in many ways, we live in this two worlds of kind of going from like the space of insanity and then the insanity of trying to show up like everything is okay. That is the everyday existence of what it means to be us, right? Um, so when we designed what was called Brothers and Sisters Thrive, and there were two separate initiatives, one was called Sisters Thrive, and then the brothers were like, well, the intersection of being Black and male also has a different lens on mental health, which was accurate. We created those efforts. Number one, to hear from the community, like, okay, so these terms mental health is not a term that in all communities is seen as a welcoming phrase. What is the language that we need to use to include people to be into that space, right? So that's one example. Another example, which dealt with our bodies, is we created a space called Yoga Noir. We just invited people who were practitioners, Black and Brown practitioners, to hold free yoga, somatic sessions in the park. We knew what areas we were prioritizing and targeting. We invited them there. Of course, there was food. Of course, there was support. But we also didn't want to bombard them that something is wrong with you, and that's why we're inviting you. We came in with the assumption that all of us have mental health that deserves wellness. And how do we include it and normalize it? That everything you're doing is connected to not just your body, but to your mind. And finally, I'll just say that, like, acknowledgement of truth is one of the most powerful ways that we combat inequity. Letting communities know that, no, we feel you escaping the horrors in South and Central America. It makes sense as to why you're at the border, and we don't see you as an other. We welcome you because we have laws that allow for individuals to come from several countries, and whether you're coming from Ukraine or you're coming through the Mexico border, we welcome you because we understand human rights infractions, right? We need to equip ourselves with that language, and then we need to challenge people that try to bring a counter narrative, because all of those things impact the mental health and the mental well-being of somebody who's just trying to, figure out how they make it from Monday to Tuesday with their child. They also need a choir of individuals that are like, no, I got you, and I know what you're going through. So I think some of it is like programmatic. How do we help people actually feel freedom through their bodies? But then also, with what we know, how do we advocate for what their body, just through empathy? How do we advocate for, what somebody's experienced, just to get, I would even say liberation, just to get freedom? Like, how do we use our bodies and risk a little bit, because we know that they risked it all just to be in this space, so we can also put a little skin in the game to make sure that we also experience liberation. Yeah, so it's more than an academic thing. I think, it's hard speaking to people, like, everyone here does so much, probably above and beyond what's in their job description every day. So in many ways, you all are the choir, right? But we want to try to enroll more people to think this way, whether they work in tech or whether they're a nurse, it doesn't matter.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I want to turn it over to folks that are here. We have a few minutes remaining, and I want to know if anyone has a question. You can either feel free to put it in the chat, and I'm more than happy to read it for you. If you'd like to come off mute and ask it yourself, ask Ify, feel free to do so. But I want to make sure that folks here have an opportunity to ask you a question if any have come up. So I will turn it over to our audience today. Does anybody have a question for Ify about the equity mindset, her story, or anything that's been shared today? And don't be shy. Now is your time to ask. I see some wheels turning. I see some people processing. I want to give it a few more seconds because if not, I have a question because I want to make sure that before you leave us today, a couple of things. One, how can people connect and follow you to stay on top of your work, to get involved in what you have going on, to access some of the resources? What are the ways in which people can follow you?
Sorry, I just put in the chat our team's website so folks can go to Pink Cornrows. And if you're on LinkedIn, I invite folks to also find me on LinkedIn. I will put in my, when your first name is 13 letters, you've got like several nicknames. So it shows up as Ifeoma EK, and folks can follow me or connect with me there.
Excellent. And I think I saw a hand from someone in the chat. Jane, I think I saw you put your hand up. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, Ed, well, first of all, thank you so much. And I think that's a lot to think about. So really appreciate your presentation. And I think, I don't know, I don't want to end this on a downer, but I think I had this moment of, we do so much to provide safe spaces, for our staff, certainly for our clients. And one of the biggest challenges is when we just don't have the resources to offer and how we continue to have to provide those respectful and safe places, but then we just don't have the goods. And I think that I just had a moment realizing what a challenge that is, for us specifically at Compass. If you have any thoughts.
I mean, I am very cognizant of not recommending anything that will have anybody lose their jobs, but I'm a proud disruptor, which is to say that I don't think that most places fully understand what it means to think about the culture we all deserve. I think when people think about D&I, and I do think that D&I is even more under attack now, is I think people think of it as a nice to have. I don't think people think about it as, whoa, everybody hasn't been safe every time that they've been doing their work. So what does that mean for folks that are even overperforming? Like, performing through harm is what we call work. We should probably maybe call it performing while being harmed instead of calling it work. But we do have to provide those visuals for folks as to this is what we deserve as a culture. And oftentimes I like to start with outlets. So from a basic perspective, if there's harm that happens, do we have outlets where people can report it and report it safely and anonymously? And oftentimes we've done a lot of culture assessments that people really haven't thought through their processes. They throw everything to HR. They think it's an HR issue. They're not really thinking about what they have to do, especially the higher up the organizational chart, if you will, which is why our practice is not called D&I. We call it ELC, which is Equity, Leadership, and Culture. We see leadership as the bridge between equity and culture, which means that leadership has to own the culture. So if it's a good culture, they get to own it. But if it's something that needs to be worked on, they don't get to run away from it. So I do think that helping leadership understand that they are the holders of this culture makes it so that every attempt to ask for resources, even if they say no, that's fine, but you have to own it. Every time we ask for a much more clear, transparent way of being safe when we report that things aren't going well, if they say, sorry, we don't have anything, great, but you have to own it. So I think that coming together and really thinking about what, if there were to be a problem right now, do we have conflict mediation tools? If somebody really needed more than the allocated days off because they're still experiencing long COVID, because many people are, including myself, how are we advocating for different types of accommodations for work? I think we have to articulate both the desire and not see it from a problem, like we have a problem that needs to be fixed, seeing it as we all deserve. It's about deservedness. We all deserve to be in a culture that allows us to be healthy and well. Most of us work and are at work longer than we're at home. So it is important for us to be well. in our workspaces, but I feel like we have to kind of create the image of like, these are the things we need. And this is the consequence if we don't do these things. That just because I show up doesn't mean I'm well. It just means I'm showing up because I have to. So those are just some thoughts. And I'm happy also offline to support with like just some concrete must-haves in the office. Rhett, maybe I'll just share like a little bit of a list of that. But I think that that would be helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Again, I want to thank you, Ife, for being here, for sharing your work with us. I'm going to stop the recording.